Somewhere over the Panjshir Valley, a Soviet pilot drops his gunship low between the ridge lines, so low the rotor wash tears dust off the rocks. For 6 years, this was the safest place to be. The fighters hiding in those mountains had learned to run at the first sound of his engines. They called his machine Shaitan-Arba, Satan's chariot. But in the autumn of 1986, a man on a ridge is not running. He is kneeling, a tube on his shoulder, waiting. And the most feared aircraft of the Cold War is about to become the hunted. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what the Mi-24 Hind actually was. When Soviet forces rolled into Afghanistan in 1979, they brought a flying machine that looked like something out of a nightmare. It had a long, hunched fuselage and a glassed-in cockpit that sat above the nose like a pair of insect eyes. Under its stubby wings hung rocket pods and a cannon, and it carried so much armor plating that pilots and engineers nicknamed it the Flying Tank. It could carry a squad of soldiers in its belly and a payload of destruction on its wings at the same time. Nothing else in the world combined those two jobs. It was a troop carrier and a gunship welded into one terrifying silhouette. For the first years of the war, that silhouette decided every battle before it began. Afghan fighters in the mountains would aim their rifles at it and watch the rounds spark off the armor and bounce away. The Hind would settle over a village, unleash its cannon and rockets, and lift away before anyone could mount a real defense. Soviet special forces learned to ride it straight into the high country, drop onto a ridge, and clear it of anything that moved. For the men in the cockpit, this was the closest thing to invincibility the war offered. They flew low, they flew often, and they came home. But here is where the story turns, and it turns on a single design decision. The Hind was deadly because it could fly low. Its cannon, its unguided rockets, its bombs, all of it needed to be close to the ground to be accurate. To insert troops, it had to descend almost to the dirt. To support a firefight, it had to come down into the same valley as the men it was protecting. The machine's greatest strength was that it lived at low altitude. And low altitude, it would turn out, is exactly where a helicopter goes to die. Because down there, all that armor stopped mattering. The Hind became a slow, loud, enormous target moving along a predictable line. And in Afghanistan, that line was almost always drawn for it in advance. That is the second half of the trap, the land itself. The Hindu Kush is not a battlefield. It is a maze of jagged ridges and narrow valleys rising more than 4 miles into thin, brutal air. At that altitude, helicopter engines choke and lift drops away. The Hind could not simply climb above the danger and stay useful because the targets were on the ground, and so were the soldiers who needed it. So, the gunships threaded the same mountain passes again and again, following rivers and roads because the terrain gave them nowhere else to go. The dust thrown up on landing could blind a pilot completely in a swirling brownout. Every valley that funneled the Hind toward its target also funneled it toward whoever was waiting on the high ground above. The Mujahideen learned the flight paths. They simply had to choose a ridge and be patient. It got worse on every approach and every departure. To put soldiers on a mountainside, the Hind had to slow almost to a hover and hang there, exposed in the thin mountain air. To lift off again, heavy and underpowered at altitude, it clawed for speed in a long, sluggish climb. Those few seconds, nose up and belly bared to the ridges above, were the most dangerous moments in the entire flight. A fast jet can outrun a threat. A loaded gunship crawling out of a valley cannot. The pilots knew it. They flew the approaches anyway because the men on the ground were depending on them. For years, though, the fighters watching from those ridges had only patience. Because their weapons could not finish the job, they fired rifles and machine guns that scratched the paint. They fired rocket-propelled grenades that almost never connected with a moving aircraft. They were handed early heat-seeking missiles, the Soviet-made Strela and the older American Red Eye, and against the Hind, these were mostly a disappointment. The seekers were crude. The Hinds crews popped flares, jinked away, and absorbed what little got through. The fighters on the ridges watched their best shots fail over and over, while Satan's chariot kept coming. All that fear, and still nothing in their hands that could bring it down. And that false sense of security is exactly what made the next chapter so devastating. By the mid-1980s, the war had become a problem the United States wanted to solve. Through a covert program called Operation Cyclone, the CIA had been arming the Afghan resistance for years. But in 1986, the decision was made to send something that had never been put in guerrilla hands before. Roughly 200 Stinger missiles began moving through Pakistan and into the mountains. A Stinger is a shoulder-launched fire-and-forget weapon. The man on the ridge points it, the seeker locks onto a heat source, he pulls the trigger, and then he can drop the tube and run while the missile does the rest. And the heat source it loved most was the hot engine exhaust of a low-flying helicopter. The first confirmed kill came in the autumn of 1986 near the city of Jalalabad. A commander known as Engineer Ghaffar shouldered a Stinger and brought down a Hind. According to one account, the first volley of these missiles took down 3 gunships in a single engagement. The fighters who had spent years watching their shots bounce off the armor suddenly had a weapon that reached up, found the engine, and pulled the machine out of the sky. Word spread through the resistance almost overnight. The Hind, the machine they had feared most, was no longer untouchable. If you're getting pulled into this story, take a second to subscribe. This channel goes deep on the technology and the turning points that decided modern wars, and there's a lot more like this coming. Now let me show you what this did to the men in the cockpit, because the numbers only tell half of it. After 1986, every flight became a calculation in dread. The Hind's old advantage, flying low, was now a death sentence. So crews were ordered to climb. But up high, the cannon lost its aim and the rockets scattered, which meant the gunship that had ruled the valleys was suddenly far less useful at the one job it existed to do. The Soviets bolted on countermeasures, infrared jammers and flare dispensers, and watched many of them fail against the Stinger's sharper seeker. They shifted to flying at night, hoping the darkness would hide them. They changed their tactics, their formations, their entire relationship with the ground. The men who once felt invincible now scanned every ridgeline, knowing that a single farmer with a tube could end them in seconds, and that there might be nothing they could do about it. The toll was real. Across the entire war, estimates suggest the Soviets lost well over 300 helicopters, a large share of them from the Mi-24 family. Russian sources put Hind losses at around 74 aircraft, with 27 of those credited specifically to Stinger missiles. The losses came fastest in the first months. In just 2 weeks of November 1986, Stinger gunners reportedly knocked 11 helicopters and a jet out of the sky, a sudden vertical spike in casualties that the old small arms war had never produced. Whole flight crews who had flown the same routes for years were simply gone in a matter of seconds. In one stretch of the war, Mujahideen Stinger gunners reportedly scored about 269 kills in roughly 340 engagements, a hit rate of 79%. And for a Hind crew threading a valley, a weapon that almost never missed was the only statistic that mattered. But this is where the legend gets complicated, and the honest version of the story is more interesting than the myth. For decades, the popular telling has been simple and satisfying. The Stinger arrived, the Hinds fell from the sky, and a single American missile drove the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. It is a clean story. It may not be a true one. Some historians who dug into the Soviet side argue the Stinger's impact was real but oversold. The missiles were often poorly accounted for, the intelligence around them was messy, and the Soviet decision to leave was driven by far bigger forces. The war was bleeding the Soviet economy dry. A new leader in Moscow was hunting for a way out, and the whole conflict had turned politically unwinnable long before any shoulder-fired missile appeared. The Soviet Union was already heading for the exit for reasons that had nothing to do with any helicopter, and yet none of that changed the math for the man strapped into the gunship. Grand strategy is decided in Moscow. The Stinger was decided on a ridge 200 yards away. Whatever the historians concluded later, the pilot still had to fly into the same narrow valley, at the same predictable altitude, past the same patient figure with a tube on his shoulder. For him, that whole debate meant nothing. The Stinger was the last thing he might ever see. In February of 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the bridge out of Afghanistan, and the war that had consumed a decade was over. The Hind survived it. The machine that had been hunted so relentlessly went on to serve in dozens of conflicts across the world, and it is still flying and still fighting today, more than 40 years after it first appeared over those mountains. So why did so many of its crews die? The answer has nothing to do with weakness. The Hind was one of the toughest aircraft ever built. They died because the very capability that made it deadly, its low-altitude attack runs, forced it down where a cheap missile fired from a man's shoulder could find the heat of its engine and pull it out of the sky. The most expensive armor in the world could not save a machine that by its very nature had to fly within reach of the people who wanted it dead. That is the quiet lesson the Hind taught the entire world. Sometimes the most fearsome weapon on the battlefield is undone not by something bigger, but by something small enough to carry up a mountain. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and stick around. Next, we are breaking down the weapons that quietly rewrote the rules of modern war, and the soldiers who never saw them coming.